Okay, hi everybody. My name is Coady Wing. I'm a professor at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. And this is another video conversation about the coronavirus epidemic. And today's conversation is about coronavirus exit strategies. And so I'm going to talk with Professor Seth Freedman, who's also at the O'Neill School and is a health economist. And we're joined as well by Professor Ana Bento, who's an epidemiologist at the School of Public Health at Indiana University. I should say at the beginning, any views expressed in this video do not necessarily represent the views of the O'Neill School or the School of Public Health or Indiana University. It's just a conversation among three professors. So welcome. I don't know if you guys have anything else that you want to say to sort of introduce yourselves, or if we should just jump right in.
No, I think we can start.
Okay, I think we should start by talking a little bit about epidemiological models. So a lot of the discussions about what's going to happen or what the likely course of the epidemic is going to be, and the different scenarios people have been talking about for how this can kind of unwind itself, ultimately come from these kinds of simulation models of how infectious diseases operate or affect a population. And I think people in general maybe just don't understand even what those models are or how they work or how data is involved in those models. So I wonder if Ana could sort of start us off by just giving us some background on the basic version of those models, and maybe also what a fancier version, what a really great version of one of those models looks like these days.
So the bread and butter, or the workhorse, actually, it's even a better word for it. The workhorse of the epidemiological models stems from the flow and the transition of the disease through the population. So we start with a population of susceptible individuals, which are individuals that never encountered a disease. And then they can flow through a bunch of compartments, for instance. So you go from susceptible, then you encounter an infected individual, you become infected. Then, depending on whatever pathogen we're encountering, let's say coronavirus, then it takes about, on average, 5.1 days to go from infected to recovered. And this is, of course, the basic and mild progression of the disease. So what these models do is actually track the transitions from one compartment to another in a mechanistic way. So we then parameterize the model using data from characteristics of the virus or the bacteria, for instance. So things like incubation period, so the time that takes an individual from becoming infected to having symptoms. So that's kind of a trait of the pathogen and the response within the host. And then parameters like the infectious period, which is also a trait of the virus, which is the number of days that an individual is infectious for, which means that is that time where the individual may or may not have symptoms, but is creating opportunities to propagate the disease onto other individuals. So this is like the basic of the basic model for infectious diseases, and it was actually created in 1927 by McCormack. And so it's a very classic model. So it's one of those things that if it's not broken, don't fix it, right? But Cody's question comes to the question of, so this is a basic model, what makes a model fancier or perhaps more realistic? So these models were created in a deterministic fashion. So means that your initial conditions, so whatever we feed into the model, be it population size, demography, population structure, you go through a transition, and however many times you run your model, you always have the same outcome, right? You follow the curve of the susceptibles over time, that you start with a lot of susceptibles and you end up with none if you don't have any strategies. You also follow the curve of the epidemic, which is the number of infected individuals over time that will peak at a specific time when it actually crosses halfway between the susceptibles and the number of infected, right? So once you hit that peak, you then go down and you end up with no infected because you run out of susceptibles in your population. So after a certain amount of time, when there's no intervention, depending on the characteristics of this infectious period and the incubation period, it will take you an X amount of time to reach that peak and then run out of susceptibles in the population. And then everybody is recovered and you have what it called a natural herd immunity in your population where everybody is now recovered and immune to this virus or bacteria. So if there's an infection coming from another population from this same virus or bacteria, this population will now be completely immunized. So therefore, no option for the infection to propagate. We can add bells and whistles to these models. We can have stochasticity in the population. So imagine you can have demographic stochasticity, and that's particularly important if the population is small, because it might lead to extinction events. Because if we run out of individuals very quickly, then the infection extinguishes very, very quickly. You can also have environmental stochasticity, and this ranges from actual environmental factors such as climate, but also has to do with opportunities for contacts, for instance. So another thing you can add to your models is contact structure. The basic of the basic SIR models assumes that the population mixes homogeneously. So there's actually no clustering and no division between subpopulations that might interact. You can add age structure, any sort of structure in the population that means there's assortativity in the mixing between individuals. And that, of course, will change the progression of the disease because it will actually decelerate somewhat in the contacts between certain types of population, the transmission rate, because if I contact more with Coady, then I contact with Dr. Freedman over there, then I'm more likely to infect Coady than I am others, right? So is this idea that adding structure to the population will actually affect the rate of progression. So then other things that you can then the implementation is also a way of making it fancier. You can have Bayesian approaches where you have prior information on your parameters and you start a simulation where you already have some prior information or guesses about the parameter space of what you're interested in finding out. Or you can have sequential Markov simulations, right? Monte Carlo simulations. But it's really just a way of trying to find out more about the uncertainty of the models. So the fancier they get, the more we can get at trying to understand uncertainty in what we don't know.
So I think a lot of people have probably heard in the popular press about two particular kind of predictions. And one comes from the UK model, which sort of seems to assume kind of business as usual. We don't have any interventions and we would see something like 2 million deaths in the United States. And the other comes from the University of Washington, which I think sort of seems to assume some amount of social distancing. And it predicts something like 100 to 200,000 deaths. Are those the main differences, or are there other differences between kind of these models that we're seeing a lot quoted?
So the Imperial model, the Imperial College model, is a classic stochastic mechanistic model, which is the ones that I described here. The Washington model is a model that is actually not mechanistic at all. It's a phenomenological model where they fit curves to the progression of disease. So in fact, they're looking at deaths because they're interested in hospital beds, right? So there's already one difference between these two models, right? The fact that one is more mechanistic and the other one is more phenomenological. It doesn't mean that the Washington model, because it's not mechanistic, is worse. But the biggest difference between these two is the Washington model, for instance, assumes that if you implement a mitigation strategy, meaning if you implement social distancing, it will work. So it's the best case scenario. It's saying whatever social distancing implementation you do, it will have a positive effect, and it will actually have, you know, an effect in the peak time, the peak date of your epidemic, the number of hospital beds that will be underused if we avoid the worst case scenario. So it's a model that is kind of it's extra positive, because it's not allowing for uncertainty in the fact that you might impose social distancing, but it doesn't mean that it's going to happen. Because
so a model that's more like the Imperial College structure, is the way that you do policy analysis, is it, you know, underlying the simulation, you know, there's parameters, maybe many parameters associated with different subpopulations.
Yes.
And one of those parameters, or maybe several of them in combination, you know, determines the probability that two people come into contact with each other. And if they do, there's some probability that an infected person infects another person. That's the basis of this. Is the way that you do policy analysis, is it not also saying, suppose I do this policy and it reduces that probability of contact or that probability of transmission given contact?
Yeah.
Is it, are you just saying they put that in as a stochastic thing too? Like,
yeah,
if I'm one of the cells in the model and you do policy X, we take a draw from an urn, and on average, it reduces my probability of transition by some amount, but sometimes it does nothing at all for me, or maybe even makes it worse.
That's
possible,
right.
and that's how you get a
that's absolutely
result.
Right, because it's not only it's a nonlinear effect, because a reduction in X does not mean a linear reduction in Y, which is what's happening in the model for the Washington model, right? Because it's basically,
you just sort of lower this thing.
You turn on the dial, turn off the dial, and you have a reduction that is almost linear. When you have this system of, it's normally a system of ordinary differential equations, but it can be discrete as well, but it doesn't matter. It's a nonlinear effect, right? Because reduction of one of the parameters, that does not mean that it's a linear reduction, because it's a kind of like a flux. It's a flux of progressions that, especially as you add, for instance, structure in the population, a change in a parameter might actually take a long time to take effect, till it goes through the system, and because the system has inertia, right? So it takes a while for a reduction in contacts, which is in effect a reduction in force of infection, to actually take its time to have a true effect. So in fact, I think 2 days ago in the Financial Times, there was a very, very nice graph that showed how long it took for all countries. And it started with the biggest hit countries like China, Italy, Spain, the US, the UK, how long it takes for these countries to have 3 days where there are no deaths. And it's taken China 60 days to come to that, right? And we know that China was incredibly aggressive in their mitigation strategies, right? Because it was imposed by the government and people actually basically stopped interacting with each other. So, these things, the biggest difference between the Washington and the Imperial model is that the Washington model, while not a terrible model, is oversimplistic in the cause effect of these interventions. Perhaps the Imperial model erred on the other side, right? It was perhaps too pessimistic, saying that, people might just not do anything. And in that case, many people will die and the health system will collapse, obviously. But what perhaps has not been advertised a lot about the imperial model is that there were actually 5 scenarios in that model, but only made the news. Most of the scenarios, in fact, you and I discussed a little bit of these scenarios, Coady, the suppression, the mitigation, right? That different scenarios will have different effects, and that's the whole point. But even these SIR mechanistic models, of which, I am a disciple, have weaknesses, right? Because even in our epidemiological models, because we're saying that we're decreasing these kinds of interventions, we're decreasing the force of infection, we're assuming that individuals will behave fairly homogeneously once we reduce these forces of infection, even though we assume that they mix assortively, right? But what we're not taking into consideration, if I tell you, stay home, you might not stay home, right?
Sure.
So that's the big difference as well.
I think a big difference, and it isn't necessarily, it depends on kind of what kind of subfield of economics you come from. But I have always thought like epidemiology and economics seem oddly connected to one another in the sense that they're both kind of model heavy disciplines on some front, and there's a lot of statistics and data analysis involved. One thing that I think distinguishes the sort of the kind of economists that hang around the O'Neill School, for example, who are predominantly like empirical, microeconomists, is that for quite a long time, like, first of all, as a field, theoretically, microeconomists are all about how individuals respond to changing conditions. So the idea that like, people would have sort of static behavior in the face of massive outbreak, that goes against the basic economic paradigm where people would be like, well, you'll have to pay me a much higher wage and I'm contracting my labor supply automatically as a result or something. Like that's the crude version of an economics reaction to these kinds of things to some extent, I guess. So that's one difference, that the individual people are not, and their internal optimization process, they're not the heart of the epidemiological model. It's almost as though the epidemic itself is the unit of analysis, and you're just modeling these flows, right?
Absolutely, you're right.
Macroeconomics and macro labor economics in particular is a bit more like that, actually, but it's not my cup of tea usually. But so I think there are connections there that are interesting.
I agree, but I hear a lot of endogenous and exogenous shocks, right? Which is something it's part of your jargon as economists, right?
Certainly, yeah.
For us, we almost think everything is exogenous because we're thinking the virus dictates the flow and we can decrease things, but it's like people are not in the equation as much. Of course, you can have individual-based models, which is
but you only believe this to a certain extent, right? This is the part where you find weakness. You're like, suppose I command social distancing. It's easy to do in the model. In the real world, maybe people will ignore me and continue to go to work. Then I don't know. It won't work, basically.
Yeah, right? Absolutely. And those are the weaknesses, and why I actually think that there's a huge space for integration in your approaches and in our approaches. In fact, the beautiful model would be a coupled model where you actually model these individual level choices and how they scale up.
Now, in fact, there is a line of work from sort of the late 1990s by an economist named Thomas Philipson, who's actually, amazingly, the current chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House, although I have not heard anything from this guy, but he did a whole line of work exactly as you've just described, attempting to sort of build an economic epidemiological model, which basically takes the sort of susceptible, immune, recovered framework and like embeds a utility maximizing agent into that space. Pretty much in the ways that seem logical to you, but he works through some behavioral implications. It's fascinating stuff, I think. His framing of it is all in terms of HIV transmission and the HIV epidemic.
Yeah.
I would say much of it applies, except that, you need to alter the examples.
Yeah.
But he thinks a lot in these papers, particularly in this one big handbook chapter that he wrote, about, how the HIV epidemic should alter the demand for condoms, over time. Like, so if local HIV prevalence or HIV prevalence in your sort of network rises, how should that alter your demand for condoms, for risky versus safe sex, for different kinds of partners, for monogamy, those kinds of relationships? That's what he's studying, Here, the epidemic is much more broad-based. Like here, I think similar concepts probably apply to like demand for restaurant meals and work outside the home and stuff, like a much deeper part of the economy. But I think similar principles are there for sure.
No, definitely. That's something that has fascinated me in this pandemic particularly. I mean, I had worked a little bit in the Ebola pandemic, but because it wasn't global, it doesn't have the consequences that this one has. And I think a particular trait of this pandemic is something that scales very well to economics models, which is the contrast of my perception of my internal risk versus the perception of external risks, right?
Sure.
This, do I only care about how it affects me, or do I care of how my behavior actually affects others around me?
Certainly things like that, that brings in lots of kind of classical economics about what the role of government is here.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's true that, to a certain extent, even if the government decided tomorrow to stop demanding that everybody stay at home and to lift its official restrictions on school closures or something like that, right? The chances that everybody would just up and go back to work immediately are pretty low. I think people would be like, that was a dumb move, local government, and I'm gonna continue reducing my demand for restaurant meals for the time being, Maybe not as much as we would like them to, given the externalities, but their private risks would lead them to restrict supply anyway, I think.
Yeah.
Well, and inherent in that is like the role of information here, right? Early on, it was the opposite. And in Florida,
yes, people don't even believe it, or
like
even
the opposite. They're more, they're private. They want to go to the beach. That's their private kind of decision making.
Right. So they're behaving purely like a, suboptimal social creature or whatever. But
I agree. Now, I think now people are sort of, have changed their perception of the private risk has changed. Right. Yeah.
I think one thing that has been, despite the fact that I think a lot of these behavioral interactions or responses are super interesting to think about, and probably, are going to alter the way people behave in a very long-term sense. Like, I think if this continues on its current course, like, surely we will think of some of these large events, lots of travel, lots of interaction, as simply being misguided, more expensive, more dangerous activities than we really realized in the past. And maybe we'll do less of them forevermore or something,
Yeah, because
that's different from the immediate reaction. It's just saying, what are you doing? You put yourself at quite a risk by doing all these activities, maybe, right? I wonder how long, that seems like a far-reaching possibility to me, that everybody will just be permanently more interested in working from home than they used to be. That's kind of neat. One thing I have been very fascinated by, and that makes me think you know, despite the fact that it doesn't have the agent-based optimizing features that, you know, I've been taught are important.
And they are
basic
important.
descriptive, yeah, but the basic like kind of mechanistic model of the epidemic, or any kind of mechanistic framework, it seems for the moment, at least across relatively short periods of time, it's enormously good at predicting what's going to happen. Like Seth and I, when this was first starting, you know, to be a topic of conversation, like, will we move classes online, close the university, what's going to happen, right? You know, and the data started being available from Hopkins. We both did versions of this thing, right? Like I made these little Poisson models predicting like fitting how many cases there are and then predicting what it would be like in 5 days or whatever, right? Like my tiny regressions of those things from like 3 weeks ago, they said we'd be right here. They worked like a charm. So like, that's hilarious. Most regressions do not do that in my life. So like, I'm impressed. Likewise, Seth did something even simpler, right? So that you could do simple things like calculate the doubling time. And then he taught his class about the rule of 72. And that's ballpark in the right space too, right? I mean, it's just held up relatively well because it just grows at that rate. You can't, of course, get any thinking like that to ever bend the line down.
Yes,
right? That's not a real model. It's
that's
just
exactly what I was going to tell you. You're fitting to the exponential part.
Exactly, right?
So
But
you get,
yeah. So I mean, for a while, it's very predictable. What's harder is to figure out when it's going to bend back down. For that, you need something more complicated.
And even with the more complex models, we're having trouble with that. Because, you know, we don't know reporting. So we don't know how reporting, we don't know the proportion of reporting that we actually have, right? Because we're not testing everyone, but also because there's this extra feature of this virus, that there's asymptomatics in the population that are possibly as infectious or maybe less infectious, but still contributing to the epidemic. So that means that it's making our life very difficult to, even with all these bells and whistles that we have in our models, that, you know, yes, we can all predict the exponential. I mean,
still it works so good.
Exactly. So we all feel really good about, hey, I can understand what's happening. But then is really the transition, is understanding when the epidemic is saturating and about to run out of susceptibles to keep going, right?
Yeah, that's right. So let me try and shift topics. So a thing I find, I have a bunch of these friends from different periods in my life who I text with, and I have lots of coronavirus text conversations with them now. And for a while, all my conversations were trying to explain about exponential functions and why they should be more worried than they are. And I would tell them about lily pads and things, because that seemed to resonate. But now I think the most confusing thing to talk about to anybody, or most disturbing thought that people eventually get to once they're like, wow, turns out it is a big deal, right? Once they get to this point and they absorb this idea that like, if we all just go out, you know, it'll spread even faster. And if we stay inside, I don't know what will happen, but that sounds like it probably will slow things down. That's the idea. And people hear this idea about flattening the curve, and that's sensible. But a thing that eventually dawns on most people is like, how can we stop ever doing the social distancing thing? Does this mean we have to stay in our homes, away from work, not going to school, whatever? Do we have to do all of that until they invent a vaccine? No. Which they hope will happen in 18 months. But like, who knows? They have to invent a vaccine. I mean, maybe it'll be harder than they think. Is that
sure.
the plan, or how do we get out of this if not
Oh,
a
no.
vaccine?
So there are several strategies. So the idea of flattening the curve is based upon the idea that if we decrease the amount of current infected in the population, we're decreasing the opportunities for infection, right? So it comes to a point where if we social distance for such a long period of time, the people that are currently infected now will recover. So they will no longer be infectious. And while because of that infectious period and incubation traits that we talked about, we have a delay in knowing exactly what that period is in terms of, if we don't know when a person became infectious, there's kind of like, let's say a 14-day delay. Let's give it a rough number. So we know more or less that if we stay like China did for 6 weeks in social distancing, that we are significantly reducing the circulation of infected individuals in the population. So that means that even though, of course, once we start back up in a situation where it cannot be business as usual, it needs to be some sort of alteration of that. And we can get to that in a minute. Mm-hmm. But if we come back and start our lives back to a semi-normal stage, even though there will still be cases of COVID circulating,
it won't go all exponential right away.
Exactly. It won't be as much because we will have decreased the opportunities for transmission significantly.
By having more recovered.
Not only that.
No, by having fewer initial infected.
Yeah. So like the seeds, right?
There will be less lingering infections.
Exactly. It's a spark, right? Each infection is a spark, right? And if you have a lot of sparks everywhere, then eventually it becomes a big thing. But if you reduce it somehow to a low enough number, then the opportunities for transmission are much lower because people will, progress into there from infected to recover.
So if we think in terms of the really basic 1920s susceptible immune recovered model that I sort of understand, are we simply saying that that model is purely deterministic? It's just some differential equations.
Yeah.
There's a path. Are we saying that if you set the initial conditions such that the initial pool of infected people is small enough, there's not really going to be a serious epidemic, and that's what we're doing? Just getting a little reset where the number of infected people is small enough that it doesn't ever take off?
Yeah, so yes and no. Yes, you are right. That's the baseline of the idea. But the amount of time we wait has to be longer than what we might expect because they're structuring the populations, right? Because there are individuals that contact more closely with others. That will change the linearity of these effects, right? So it's stochastic in the sense that we can't predict all of the contacts that will happen, right? Mm-hmm. So yes, we can say if there are fewer infected, then it's likely that the infection will die out because it's the stochastic process anyways. But it's not that simple that we know exactly how many should be there because of these different kinds of structures in the population. And also we don't know yet if, individuals that are infected that progress into severe cases, are they more infectious? Are they the same infectious but have a bigger response in terms of immune response or not? So there's a few things that we don't know. And also it's predicated on the asymptomatics, right? Because we don't really know how many there are out there. We're assuming that the progression is exactly the same. So we're saying, okay, let's not think about the asymptomatics for now, but let's kind of bring down the numbers that we have for now, let them recover. And then there's far fewer in the population to cause big outbreaks.
So there are some
but I guess coming back to the similar question, but so how should I think about the difference between the very start of the epidemic and where we might be in the summer, where we kind of start over again in some sense? We go back to leaving the house. We have no cases around or very few cases around. Yes, there are some people who are potentially immune. Other than that, what's different? Is it just that we're more vigilant about responding to when infections do pop up, or is there something different about the model at that point?
So the model at that point is already assuming that there's more immune individuals in the population, for instance. So the recovered class is much bigger. So I'm not saying we're close to herd immunity because we don't know just yet. So until we actually do a mass serological test and check immune status of people, we won't know for sure. So
well, and social distancing will make us be less likely to have herd immunity, right? We'll have fewer infected, but we'll have had less recovered as well, right?
So
there's so much uncertainty, you know. There's a lot of people on Twitter who are like, you know, adamant that the total number of infected people is just extremely large.
Yeah.
One upside of that possibility, and that the asymptomatic rate is very, very high. Most people do not get an extreme case. This is an opinion, right? If that's the case, we might reach herd immunity faster than you think. Because
absolutely. But because of the uncertainty, we have to err on the caution, right? So one of the strategies that has been proposed is this intermittent social distancing, right? Where, you know, perhaps a subset of the population goes back to work, but not all at the same time.
Okay, this is great. So this is like plan number one, where plan number one is at some point, and we're not totally sure what will trigger plan number one, some amount of time of social distancing or getting the cases down. But at some point we'll be like, okay, these groups of people can now come out. Maybe they're occupation specific, or maybe they are age specific. We don't know, but we'll pick some. Not everybody though. And is the idea that they'll come back out and we'll keep an eye on it. If it looks like it's taking off, we'll all run back inside again?
Yeah, pretty much.
Or is it that we'll like rotate? There'll always be only 25% of us out there in full circulation, and we're just keeping it.
So there's the two possible scenarios, right? That intermittent, some in, most, like some out, most in, but we rotate. But there's also that idea that if you put some people out, that you can choose perhaps a subset of the population that the perception is that they might be at lesser risk. That, you know, if something goes wrong, you know, you go back to the draconic, you know, like very serious shelter in place quarantine measures. But it has been proposed, and that's something, especially in my group, we're playing with, is this idea of how much do you decrease just to be below what we call the R effective, which is, you know, if R effective, it's the secondary cases one case can produce, right? So if R effective is just below 1, it means that, you know, you can put some people out, but, you know, you have a few cases, but you don't have a big outbreak. So kind of like, what is that magic number in a simulation scenario where you know all the infections, right? And then you start thinking, okay, so if we assume that asymptomatics are 20%, 30%, 50%, then you start kind of playing with what that magic number is in the uncertainty
in the
that
simulation.
You can't report these.
Or how fragile is it around the
exactly
point?
It's like an elasticity, almost an elasticity kind of sensitivity elasticity analysis.
So let me ask you this. Suppose that some version of that is the plan we go with. In a real world version of that plan, like I have to say, a lot of these plans sound like, I'm perversely, as I think we all a little are, I don't want anybody to die or get sick or whatever,
No,
but
of course not.
I find this a fascinating event to live through, honestly. That plan of like rotating tranches of people who will work and other people won't, how we would implement that in a large democracy, I find mind-blowing.
It might not be feasible, right?
Well,
but did you ever think we could implement?
Let's think this through.
Everyone staying home.
What do you think it would look like, Seth? If you did do this, you were like, let's suppose we say the magic number is like 20% can be working. So you gotta decide how you will implement this. Let's have 20% people, they can come back and be free. Everybody else is going to stay home, look out the window at the 20% walking about. How will we actually operationalize it? Will you get like a day a week? Like everybody gets a day, or what do you do?
I mean, I guess one way to think about doing it would be like, right now we have a definition of like essential services or essential industries, right? And maybe we ramp up which industries we add to that pool of like allowed to be working.
Okay, so we would find out who's most valuable for them, and we would let them
perhaps go. We have some kind of lottery maybe where we, but yeah, I mean, I agree. At the same time, I never would have thought in a democracy like we live in that we would tell everyone to stay home, and actually lots of people kind of
True.
do.
And we've managed, it's not that impressive.
Not,
there are some
I
people
didn't say
who are
everybody
clearly
is, but
not
lots of
taking
people are, you know.
What's that?
I said certainly not as many as we might want to be, but still a lot of people
I
are.
don't know.
I mean,
that's what I was just going to say. I am unsure if I'm impressed with people or disappointed in people. Like I have this conversation in my house all the time, where occasionally we encounter someone who we think is not taking it seriously. And then we say negative things about them when they're not around, right? And people are so gossipy, it's wild. Right? So that's a thing. Like I witness things where I'm like, that you shouldn't do that probably. You're making it harder for other people to take it seriously because it's awkward to have to step back from you when you come too close to me. Right? Don't come too close to me because I don't want to have to back away from you. Like there's those kinds of interactions, right? That's weird. On the other hand, it's very hard for people to be socially distanced from one another. People are social creatures. They like to hug each other and talk to each other and do these things. And we are elaborately socially distanced right now. So maybe I'm impressed that people are willing to enforce that on themselves, even though clearly they don't want to or really don't like to. Maybe I should be more impressed than I am. We don't have any police with guns or batons or anything like that beating you back into your house in the United States. So it's mostly voluntary compliance so far. Maybe you should be impressed. I don't know. Are you impressed or are you unimpressed with people on net?
I'm unimpressed.
You're unimpressed?
I'm unimpressed because even though I see your faith that people are somewhat complying, I still see a lot of people not complying. And I guess we are lucky that we live in Bloomington, that, you know, most of the population left, the students actually left, right? And then by default, there aren't many people left in town, I guess. So we don't really see people around. But, you know, we have Florida, we have California, where people are still going to parks. We had New York, where the governor...
Where they were lining up to see the boat come in.
Right?
That was particularly ridiculous. I agree. Like the boat was coming for an ominous reason, you know?
So people are still misbehaving terribly.
Okay.
So I don't know. I
this
still...
in some sense is some combination of weird disbelief. Like my bias is I feel like the older people in my life cannot take it seriously. They insist
I agree with you.
Fine.
Yes, I'm having the worst time with my parents.
Yeah. So I feel like this is a thing, but it could just be my bias. You know, I don't know if on net that'll hold up. Because you'd think they should take it even more seriously. They're more likely to die of the, you know, but. Okay, so one plan, we've done one plan. This was supposed to be our main topic.
Oh, yes,
one
yes.
plan is rotating shards of people. Seth came up with lotteries.
Yes.
job
specific or industry specific.
So let's add to the plan. Let's add to the plan back to what Anna was talking about, those who we can hopefully test and find that they are recovering.
The antibodies.
Right? Then we have an antibody passport.
Right.
And will we give you a special shirt to wear so that we know you're allowed outside and you're not a cheater? Or how will we verify that you're not just breaking the rules? It's very complicated, this rotating business.
Yep. You have an app on your phone that you can show people.
There you go.
A star. That
like a plane ticket, only for going outside your house.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so that was one plan, rotating shards. Let me tell you about another plan, Anna, and you tell me whether this is realistic or wildly over the top or what. Okay, so there's an economist named Paul Romer who won the Nobel Prize not long ago. And versions of his plan have been picked up on by other people too. So I don't know how necessarily unique it was, but I read it first from him. He said, here's a plan-ish, like a rough plan.
Yeah.
Okay. We're gonna stay inside for a bit, but we can't stay inside forever because it's gonna be absolutely crushing.
Yeah.
Before long, right? We're a rich country, but you can't just shut down the economy forever. So he says, right now, while we're all inside, the key thing is we gotta ramp up our ability to do cheap tests very fast.
Yeah.
Right. And he thinks we should get to a system where you can do the fast test that's like half hour, 45-minute test, or maybe less if we're lucky. And we should get to a system where we basically test everybody every day, right? Or everybody once a week or something, high frequency testing. And if you test negative, off you go, live your life, go shopping, go to school, go to work. If you test positive, quarantine.
Yeah.
And the people around you quarantine. That's it, right? If you test positive and recover and have antibodies, okay, free pass again, right? And then that plan will chug along at 50, 75% economic activity, because that'll still be quite the situation, basically. But we do that, and we just keep on holding out like that until finally either everybody has the antibodies, because slowly but surely people have gotten it and done some time in time out, or we get a vaccine, and then we have to ramp up and do a mass vaccination campaign, which is its own thing.
So to me, that's the biggest challenge, actually. It's
the vaccination part is
it's once you get a vaccine, now how do you implement it? Because you cannot say, let's pretend January 1st, 2021. You cannot vaccinate everyone on the same day.
Yeah.
I mean,
no, it'll take forever. It'll be a huge thing just to do it, right?
Do we do pulse vaccination? Do we say, are these populations at risk, so therefore they go first? Do we vaccinate the elderly first and then the other population, right? What is the best strategy?
Yeah. Physicians first or nurses first, whatever, these things.
Exactly. So like, so I don't
But still
know.
On net, you think is that a plan or is that overkill? Every daily testing, and that's your entry to the world. You need to do it.
So
like you would come to the university every day. The universities, you'd all line up, get tested.
So
and go to your office.
I think
they go to your office, yeah.
Logistically, I see that that's probably not feasible because it would take you like probably the whole morning to get to work.
Just because even if, I don't know how it works. How do the rapid tests even work? Could I have a giant box of these things at my house and it just, I do it at home? So
they would have to develop one that is a home kit.
And is that likely or that's impossible?
It's not impossible. So that they're trying to develop these like field kits that could be translated into home kits. But I don't know how quickly, to be honest. I do not know how quickly this can be implemented because you have to remember that tests, because they are tests, there's a thing called specificity and sensitivity that leads to false positives, false negatives, and so on, right? So there's the first caveat.
So Paul Romer's own homebrew epi model, he says that will be a third order consideration given this sensitivity and specificity. See, he's not worried about that.
Oh, I see. So,
too much.
All right.
Although hypothetically he was worried about that, but he thinks it's not an issue.
Yeah. So depends, right? Depends how good the test is.
It does, yeah.
But if you decrease the specificity to, let's say, like 60%.
It would matter at some parameter. He's saying, given the current test, he doesn't think it's a problem.
Yeah. So, that's the first caveat I see. Then there's the second of, unless you do it at home every day and you process this information, and by the time you get to work, there's a green light for you to go in.
Yeah.
You're actually going to waste more time trying to get to work than to work from home.
Yeah, see, so maybe weekly that could be more feasible, but I agree. That is one reaction I had to his plan too, was that the social organizational apparatus of wide testing like that sounds hard, like almost insurmountable, right?
And
like
the production of that many tests.
Yes, it just
they need to be churning out. Like now they're like water. You need them daily to like survive.
Yeah, exactly.
Even weekly sounds
like a lot, right? Yeah.
I agree. So if they're struggling to do them now, when you only want to test a person once, right? Let alone
with enough time, of course, there's plenty of products in the economy that we produce for daily use.
Yeah.
No, people use daily contact lenses. I mean, they make a lot of them, it's fine.
I agree.
Anna, what do you think about fever testing instead as sort of our signal?
There you go.
Is that?
Yeah. That's an interesting one, and something that so they're doing a lot of that in New York hospitals. So that's how they test if medical providers are fit to continue working, for instance. But remember that even if you're not developing asymptomatic carriage, there is on average about 5 to 6 days that you are incubating. You don't have symptoms, but you are
no fever, but you infect everybody.
So by the time you detect the fever, it's too late, almost, in some sense.
So while it's not a bad check for people that are transitioning, but it's
and in the absence of testing, presumably better than nothing.
Absolutely.
So it seems like what that would let you do is identify pockets of sort of outbreaks that are occurring, and then you implement the shelter in place for that city. So at least we could think of it like at a city by city level instead of a state by state or the whole country. Exactly. So like we wouldn't quite get to the individual person. People can go to work or can't go to work. It's sort of the cities or counties that can be in operation versus sheltering in place.
Yeah, exactly. But remember, there's a synchronicity, right? So, sorry, go ahead, Coady.
Oh, I was just gonna say another kind of technological like workaround that people have suggested, which like I'm not sure whether this is actually the thing or if it's just a nice reminder that like there are creative solutions to a lot of these things lurking out there. So maybe you shouldn't be so it shouldn't be so hard to imagine that we could do something like as unfathomable as daily testing. Maybe it's possible. And you just haven't thought of exactly how to do it yet. But one group of people seems to be saying there could be huge efficiency gains from batch testing. So you pool everybody's tests together, test them all. And I don't know how clever they're being, but you can start, if you're a stats person, you can start thinking about how to really do this optimally. But if you test you dump everybody's sample into one big pile and test the whole thing, that takes like 2 seconds, and you're like, everybody's clean in here, or now one of you is infected, and then now there's a series of responses.
Yeah,
so I mean, maybe that's how you speed things up, is stuff like that. I don't know. Like we would all arrive in like
time slots.
The SPIA building would get tested. You'd be like, oh, someone is infected. Like maybe it works that way.
But maybe it shouldn't be all the SPIA. It should be random people.
I know. If you do it, that's why I was thinking like there are probably even cleverer versions of this, because maybe your sample goes into 7 different batch pools.
Yeah.
And that way we can determine if you are positive with pretty high probability.
Exactly.
Even though they were all batched. Like you could cook up these schemes, I bet.
Oh yeah, I agree. So
but that's a hard thing to do high frequency, it sounds like, because you have to pool the batches somewhere, right?
Well, but you would use like social groups that people belong to, I guess, as a way to do this. Or somehow you need to drop your sample into some like localized testing area. And but maybe it can go lickety split then. I don't know. These are pretty vague proposals. I will say the person who wrote most elaborately about this batch testing idea that I read was in the Wall Street Journal, I think, by Larry Kotlikoff, who's a macroeconomist. And I was like, this is clever. I can see why you like this. Yeah. You seem to lack the credentials to know how to do it, though. So I don't know.
So there are geneticists.
I would have felt better if it was a dude from a drug company with a plan, you know, but
there are geneticists proposing that. It's
that sounds like they're in their space, you know.
Exactly. So it's a 16 sample batches that they're proposing.
Okay.
So it's based on population genetics tests called pool sequence, where you're looking at the variability of a specific population by instead of sequencing you, me, and Seth, we put all of our DNA in one pool of sequence and see, is there enough variability for us to consider structure in a population, right? So it's the same kind of idea where you pool all of these things and, okay, is there enough variability in the response, the antibody response to this test to make us believe that at least one of you is infected.
Right.
So it's, I guess, a cost benefit thing, right? So it costs less if nobody's infected and we all go. And then every once in a while, we have to test more people than we would have otherwise, I guess. But it's definitely something that has been done for many, many years in population genetics, this idea of how in a pool you can identify differences.
Right. Okay, let me shift. Let's make this I think we should probably make this our final topic, if not already.
I'm having so much fun.
I know this has been really fun, but we've been admonished to not take so long. So far we talked about two broad plans, the plan where we have rotating casts of people out there and the one where we test every day. Those are plans for just getting out of the current lockdown. Okay. What do you think the plan, the longer term plan, and by this I mean first order, like when we kind of do get out of this mess using whatever mechanism, maybe something we've not heard of yet or thought of yet. We do get out of it. One, what kinds of policies are we going to need to ramp back up or speed the transition or whatever that is apt to be? And then if you have to be all crystal ball at the moment, what do you predict for what do you think the weird long-lasting responses to this will be? Is part of getting out of this mess like let's do more online classes, like forever, not for now, but for always? Is that important? Or when we get out of this, are we like, no, we'll basically go back to normal again, but we're going to be serious about catching this kind of thing early next time and not ignore it because, whoa, it could get out of control.
Yeah.
Or are you like, no, we can't take this risk. There are certain things we need to stop doing.
Yeah, so I think it's a mix.
Have that as the conversation.
I think it's a mix, and Seth, you have an economics approach, which is probably different from mine because of the way we think, right? But from an epidemiological point of view, I think it's a mix of both, right? The major problem of this epidemic was preparedness, right? We did not know how to prepare for this. So all of what we're doing is reactionary, right? We're reacting to a problem. We're reacting to the magnification and snowballing of the problem. So we're kind of playing catch up constantly. We're still losing, right? Because we're increasing testing, but not enough. We're implementing social distancing, but we cannot control that everybody is complying. So we're constantly reacting to pockets of increase, like New York, right? New York got out of control. So I think it has to go back to the drawing board to understand, in a case of a novel pathogen, how can we prepare? So it's more like shifting from reaction interventions to preparedness.
Mm-hmm.
There's always an adaptive management to any sort of these kinds of situation, because you know that if you implement a strategy, it's going to alter the dynamics of the transmission. So you're always kind of adapting your management strategies anyways. But it has to go to this idea of, okay, so what failed and what can we kind of change in terms of preparedness for this? So I think that changing our behaviors is definitely one of them. So in fact, this morning I was talking to a group of colleagues about preparing a symposium for the end of this year, so by December. So some of them were like, oh, by December we can do it in person. But then we started thinking, do we actually need to have a symposium in person if people are coming from all over the US? How much are we gaining in actually hanging out with these people in terms of network value versus, you know, having an environmentally friendly meeting that perhaps needs to be shorter because there are no coffee breaks, you know? It ends up being a lot cheaper because we don't have to pay for flights. So I think there now becomes that idea of what kind of social in-person interactions are essential, and which ones can we actually create a venue for a different way of interacting.
I think I agree in terms of like professional like interactions, like you're just saying. I was thinking of two things if I'm going to look into the crystal ball, and one is, Coady, you were sort of talking about like maybe we'll decide that giant sports stadiums aren't such a great idea. But you know, I think back to after 9/11, when people were sort of on edge about sort of further terrorist attacks, and like sports stadium sounded like a great candidate for some kind of mass casualty terrorist attack. And it didn't take too long for stadiums to fill back up. And so I think there's some of that.
Airports have never been the same though.
That's true. That's true. Airports have never, and sports stadiums have metal detectors now too, as well, I guess. So like but I think there are certain sort of cultural things that people will be very hard for people to give up. At the same time, I think, and there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity in this, I think, but like, I think some people are going to come out of this being like, oh, it's nice to spend a little bit more time with your family and to not be such a workaholic and those kinds of things. So like, I feel like maybe we'll see some kind of shifts in those kind of social norms around work and family time and things like that for some groups.
I wonder a little bit about how much along those same lines. I don't know. I'd like to think that people will, get in touch with some deeper thing that matters, like family time or something like that. Maybe that's true. I don't know.
Other people might react totally the opposite. Like, oh man, I'm so glad to be back at work and away from.
Some people might have this reaction too. Yeah, I don't know. It probably depends on the person, right? As it always has. But I will say that there'll probably be some like induced technological improvements or changes that are going to happen.
Yep.
And some of that technological change, not even the product itself, it's the user base. Like I have thought so far that I am deeply impressed with Zoom.
Oh, me too.
I was shocked that it didn't crash immediately when all this happened.
Yeah, I thought it would suck. And I have used Zoom before and always thought, stupid Zoom. It's the same Zoom. I don't know why I hated it. I just had a bad attitude or something. Because like, I'm sitting here talking to you right now. Sucks a bit. Like I'd rather be at school, like hanging out or whatever, I suppose. But like, it works pretty well.
Yeah.
Right. I'm looking at you. We're talking. It's not hanging up on us.
True.
It's keeping track of who's talking. It's beautiful. And I don't need to be very skilled to use it. It worked almost on the first try for me. I was like, oh yeah, I'm good. I got this. There are little doodads that I'm still learning, of course, but it's pretty good. And I think that's the experience of a lot of people. I loved, when the university said like, we're putting everything online, you should spend some time in class this week teaching your students how to use Zoom. It's going to be important, we think, right? So in class, I did this. And the funniest thing was that, first of all, I sent out the Zoom link and the students clicked the link like the night before. They just received it and clicked the link like automatically, even though I was like, click this tomorrow at 11:30, you know. So they did it right then. And I had set up the thing to like auto record, which I think is a mistake in retrospect. But I love that I did this because I have these videos now of these random undergraduate students, and that they sign on and then they have this look on their face where they're like that. It's like they're looking into the computer. They're like, is this working? I can't
like
see
knocking
anybody.
at the screen, anybody there.
You almost expect they have this frown, and then they like swear and log out, right? I have like 10 of them, and then it's just how people look, right? When they don't know what it's doing. And now when they log on in my class live, they don't do that. They just log on. There they are. You know, they're not like, what is going on? You know. They just know how to use it now. It's fine. It took 3 days. So like, no big deal. Zoom is good technology. Yeah. The next 5 iterations of Zoom are probably going to be amazing. There'll be other companies. There'll probably be physical, like non-software technologies that improve it further. You could totally imagine these things happening, especially if this keeps up. So the amount of online conferences, symposiums, working from home, it presumably is going to improve remarkably. So that's fascinating. I mean, that could be a big deal in higher ed, frankly. So.
Absolutely. I don't think we would be hanging out at this time on, you know.
No,
that's right.
Though we have no substitutes right now, right? This is you're the best thing on TV. Like currently, I'm watching movies from the 90s that remind me of a different time. So you guys are fine, you know, but.
No,
but there are a lot of parallels to wartime, right? Like it changes the structure of the economy in order to respond, and then some of those changes are very long lasting. Yeah,
absolutely.
So do you have other than remote communication technologies and the amount that we'll be willing to like live our social lives that way? That seems like a potentially big deal if it happens. What else? What do you imagine is the new trend or the new normal social thing that's quite different from now? Or do you have anything? I don't know.
I don't know.
I mean, I think we'll rethink in some ways, sort of, well, 2 things: health insurance in general.
Yeah.
And especially having it tied to work. And I think that's going to change how a lot of people think about that. But public health, people will know what an epidemiologist is now, right? And they'll have.
I think undergraduate enrollment in epidemiology programs is going to go through the roof.
Yeah, my dean will be happy.
I bet it's a huge boost for sure.
So I have one. I think people will not easily shake hands for a long time.
I agree.
You do? Yeah. You don't think, Seth, that's one of those ones that's like deeply woven? You're like, no, they'll drop that.
I think people will. People might hug.
No, so is that
not
any better?
Hands. No, it's not. But you tend to hug.
You hug someone you love.
Yeah.
Shake hands with like every random nut bar that you come across. Yeah. You don't need to be doing that.
Exactly, right? But you might still keep your hugging delivery, daily hugs to your loved ones or your close ones. But I honestly believe that shaking hands is going to probably become a thing that is just going to be gone.
So my daughter and I were having a funny conversation about shaking hands versus other things, and we were thinking of all the different ways, I was trying to get her to think of all the different ways you can say hello to people. Not that she shake hands a lot anyway. So we were doing like, fist bumps and elbow bumps, because I had read this funny little article that said a fist bump is is 50% better, 50% safer than a handshake. So it's not a good idea. It's better to not fist bump, but that's better than a handshake.
So the bros are okay.
Elbows, oh yeah, people love elbows. Elbows, it's ridiculous though. Nobody's gonna do the elbow bump.
I agree.
But so, you know, there's plenty of cultures where it's like a bow or something completely different.
Or kiss in the cheek, right? So for instance, if
kiss in the cheek is like further, it's even worse, right? That's further down. That's Italy.
So I really hope that stops, because
it's a terrible idea.
It's like the most terrible.
I never liked it anyway.
Yeah.
So
not only it creates social awkwardness, because if one party is not expecting the kiss in the cheek, and then it becomes very awkward.
Okay, so let me tell you about the one that no one is pushing, but I think you need to go back and watch this movie and then do it. So there's a terrible Wesley Snipes action movie from my youth called Demolition Man.
I've heard of it, but I've never watched it.
You need to go watch it. I've just watched it.
Okay.
It's very funny. And so in the movie, it's got Sylvester Stallone in it, and he is, he's a cop, but something goes awry. There's corruption, and he's arrested and put in the cryo prison for a long time. And then he up and wakes up, and it's like the deep future. Okay. And his life, the life is very different because society has gone through mass epidemics and all these things, and so they live this different way now. And they don't shake hands anymore or give high fives or anything. And he keeps bumping into people, and they hold up their hand, and he high fives them, and they're like appalled because he's like hit them, touched them, it's not okay. And what they do is they act like they're gonna high five. He views them as just an incredibly dorky society, right? Like he's you, and they're ridiculous, right? They give the high five, but they stop like about this far apart, and then they go,
oh,
right? We should do that. It's so funny.
So I have to confess. So I've been working with some of my team on one of our COVID projects, and we're socially distancing, but we've been in the same room. And because we've reached some good moments of the model, of the proposal you saw, Coady. And we've actually done some virtual high fives. But we're not doing any further magic because we're not as cool as Demolition Man. But maybe there's a thing. And I had a colleague who greeted me like this. So
He's just desperate to make that happen, right?
In sports, sports, there's the jump in the air and smash your backsides against each other too. We could do that.
There you go. That might not work. That's age dependent,
Yes. Hip replacements might increase. Right. So, but definitely. But if I put money on it, I'd say handshakes are a thing of the past.
Handshakes are going away. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's a pretty good end note. The death of the handshake is coming for you. Maybe mass testing or rotating, days out of prison. That's what it can be. Those are the options on the table at the moment. Maybe batch testing as well. All right, I think we can stop. I'm going to stop recording.
All right.
I don't think we have any viewers left at this point, but you never know. Oh wait, not end meeting.